Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer and Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, our guest today is Courtney Marchesani. Courtney Marchesani is a clinical health coach and the author of the new book, The Four Gifts of the Highly Sensitive. You can find out more about Courtney Marchesani and her wonderful work at her website, inspiredpotentials.com. Welcome, Courtney Marchesani.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
So, Courtney Marchesani, your new book is called The Four Gifts of the Highly Sensitive. Those of us who are intuitive have different ways of explaining the four gifts. In your view, what are the four gifts?
Well, over time, over 20 years of research, I saw patterns emerge in sensitive people. My friends, people that I worked with, and I saw four. There's likely a lot more. But the first one I started to investigate was intuition. So, intuition is the first, empathic individuals is the second, vision is the third, and expression is the fourth. And that's how I break them out in the book. So, intuition, empathy, vision, and expression are the four that I delineate.
Fabulous. Now, one of my books, Unlimited Intuition Now, talks about the four primary psychic gifts. And there I talk about claircognizance, which is psychic knowing, where you just know stuff. Clairvoyance was where you see and where you receive information in terms of symbols. Clairaudience is where you hear and where you receive words or sounds. And finally, clairsentience, which is psychic feeling. So it's really fascinating to talk to people who have different ways of explaining this. Now, your book, The Four Gifts of the Highly Sensitive, Courtney Marchesani, you're specifically writing for highly sensitive people. So, in your view, what does it mean to be a highly sensitive person?
Well, it was clinically studied. So I think the reason I wrote the book was for individuals who are sensitive and who feel profoundly or have these intense experiences. They would have something to draw from that's very clinical. So, clinically, sensitives were studied in the 90s, in the early to late 90s, and they were formally kind of accepted through this process of testing. It really is what it was psychometric testing. But at that time, they didn't include intuition. They didn't include empathy. None of that is included in the highly sensitive person scale that first identified sensitives. Okay, so this is a different kind of work, but it falls in that spectrum. Sensitivity is defined clinically as individuals who perceive more through their five senses. So sight, sound, touch, taste, and hearing. But they also have faster emotional reactivity to what they feel. So they feel more through their sensory awareness, and then they respond faster with their emotions. It's called emotional reactivity. And that's kind of the piece that we can all really relate to, is the emotional part.
Okay. And if you could, for a great definition, and so some of our audience may be listening and may think, what if I'm a highly sensitive person? What are some of the clues, Courtney Marchesani, for our audience as somebody's listening that may indicate to them that they're highly sensitive?
Well, it comes through different ways. Like you said, you have your language, right? Your lingo to describe it, clairsentience, clairaudience. I break it down into feeling states, through the mind and the body, because that's how I was trained as mind body medicine. So you will be able to tell that you're sensitive in relationship to your environment. So, loud noises, not being able to be around certain people that you find toxic, right? That's the word that's commonly used, but people who feel suffocating or chaotic or intense to you. You'll also have physical reactions, actual physical sensations that warn you through your central nervous system that you've taken on too much in an environment. It's called a threshold, your own threshold. So you'll feel your body have sensations like tingling. Sometimes it's numbing. Other times it'll feel like buzzing. It'll really depend. Sometimes it's fluctuations between heat and cold temperatures. So you have to really pay attention to those subtle sensory warning signs, is what I call it. Because a lot of times sensitive people push through the sensory warning signs because they don't want to deal with their body or their mind because it takes too much. A lot of times this is an internal perception. They don't really want to stop and handle it, mostly through self-care or stepping away from the environment. We have a tendency more to push through. And that's how you'll be able to tell. Exhaustion, tiredness, feeling like you're going to have a come apart, like you can't handle or you don't have enough internal resources to deal with social situations. So it runs the gamut, how you're able to tell. But those are the primary ways, is that in your environment, you'll start to pick up or feel certain types of sensations.
Now, Courtney Marchesani is the author of the book, Four Gifts of the Highly Sensitive. I can make the outrageous assumption that you're also a highly sensitive person.
I am. I'm probably pretty far out on the spectrum. I have the test, the sensitive gifts test that I developed, but I'm also trying to figure out where that cutoff point is, if there is one, for people that are farther out on the spectrum, that are hypersensitive, is what I call them. I mean, that term is out there in the clinical world, but it's not taken seriously. It hasn't been studied, but there is definitely a effect where you are more easily reactive and you respond quicker. And there really is, especially for the empaths, there's really not a filter. We're not filtering out anything really. And it's very difficult for us to filter out emotions, thoughts, energies. And so people who are farther out on the spectrum, like myself, are more deeply affected by these experiences with others.
Okay. Now, I just want to make a comment about what you said, because the way again, the way I look at it is, are you high in claircognizance or high in clairvoyance or higher in clairsentience and so on? And what you're talking about a lot is what I call clairsentience, which is literally feeling. And the way I like to put it is, if you put your hand on a hot stove, you wouldn't think, what's wrong with my hand? You'd be like, I need to take my hand off the stove and then my hand will feel better. But when you're in the soup, in the energy soup, and you're feeling everything so intensely, part of what I think highly sensitive people need to do is figure out what is mine and what is something that I've picked up from other people. So a really good tip that I give for highly sensitive people is to get by yourself 3 times a day and tune into yourself and ask yourself, how do I feel? And just get a sense of like what your home base feels like. And then if your energy shifts, within, a 4 to 6 to 8 hour window, then that it's possible that you may have picked up energy and emotions from your environment. Now, Courtney Marchesani, when did you first notice in yourself that something unusual was happening with your gifts?
It was in my 20s, and I didn't know I had any gifts. I mean, I didn't know I was any different. I had the classic um, visionary experience. I had a precognitive dream of something that was going to happen in the future. I didn't know that's what it was. I just was. I had a very vivid dream when I was in my mid 20s about a man who had driven through a stop sign. He got pulled over by the police. They looked in his trunk. I'm like in the dream. It's like I'm there with them, right? Very lucid. And he had all these drugs and guns, and it was shocking. And so then he went to the court in the dream. He was in front of a judge. He had his hands shackled behind his back in front of the judge being sentenced. So I woke up from the dream, I was with my ex-husband at the time. We were living in Missoula, Montana, going to college. And I was afraid. And I said to him, I woke him up and I said, I'm worried about this individual. And I wasn't friends with the guy, but my husband knew him as an acquaintance. And so, his response was, I don't even really hang out with him. You're being paranoid. Well, then a month later, the dream played out, and the exact section where he was in front of the judge with his hands behind his back was exact. I mean, it was a mirror image, as the way I saw it in my dream was on the television screen in my living room in Missoula on the local nightly news. So I looked at him, of course, and I was astonished. And he looked at me, and it was just a profound thing. Now, he still never really acknowledged that it was a precognitive. And so other precognitive experiences like that, very similar to that, happened, and he would always just negate them. So because I didn't know, right, that I had the intuitive visionary ability, I had to figure it out for myself. I didn't have any teachers or I didn't have any help. So I started to investigate it myself, and that's what started my research journey into understanding the gifts. And so since then, I've had profound things happen that have been life-saving for other individuals. Not just myself and my own family, but for other people in my community.
That's very cool. And I do think that it is helpful if you are a highly sensitive person to know people who are this way, because that way you don't think you're crazy. Otherwise, a lot of times people might call you crazy.
I was. There's no doubt. I mean, I was called crazy. And once I started to really explore what it was, years later, I mean, it was a couple years later, I actually stopped a fire in a Seattle brownstone. And before it happened, and so that was another anomalous experience, or a exceptional experience that couldn't be denied. There were witnesses, there were people that saw the whole progression of me saying, we need to go back, we need to go back, we need to go back, without having any evidence as to why. But nobody understood it. So I do think if you know people who've had these experiences, it's helpful. But there's also the belief system. So in my belief system, I did not believe that these kind of things could happen. I was raised in an environment where this wasn't even acknowledged. I mean, it wasn't even a thing. So it took me many years to unravel it. And I think that's one of the reasons, really the big reasons why I wrote the book. When I started to look for resources to understand what this was, I didn't really find that much. And so I wrote the book that I would have wanted to find when I was in my 20s on my search.
Now, Courtney Marchesani, you mentioned that you had done research. What kind of research have you done on these subjects? Or did you read about it? Did you look up other people's research, or did you do your own research on these subjects?
Well, in college, I was a supervised research student. And so my own clinical research started there, where I was supervised in the neuropsychology department. We did a study on traumatic brain injury and wearing helmets on the ski slopes. And so that's kind of where it started for me, where I would actually interview people and took surveys and talked to them. And then we took that research and put it into a statistical analysis. That's when it started. And that was when I was, in my 20s. So research that I did fell along the lines of my work. So I worked in mental health, and I worked with individuals who were called mentally ill. That's what we would call the population that I served. And so I did research in my population, and also wrote grants and did funding. And so I have done research. I do a lot of research in terms of reading other people's stuff and the journal articles that are there, medical. And I'm doing my own research now on the afterlife. So I was accepted into the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies to do research and prove, basically, or show proof of the existence or survival of consciousness after physical death. And that's my own research. So I basically have a sample size of sensitive people, and out of that, I'm doing research on how many of those individuals are having anomalous experiences that include contact with the afterlife or perceiving their own pre-life memories. Or you said at the opening about symbolic communication. So symbolic communication is part of this as well. And those individuals who receive symbols. And so, my question to you is, do you receive symbols?
Well, my primary gift is I'm claircognizant, which I know things. So I don't have to see someone or put my hands on them to know what's wrong or what will work to make them better. Everything that you have discussed, I have done. So,
Mhm.
for example, I remember years ago, there were two young men who went mountain climbing. I think it was up in Washington State. And anyway, they started out, there was a sudden snowstorm and they died, and there were 50 people on the mountain looking for them. And I
Mhm.
communicated with their souls to sort of figure out what had happened and where they were and locating them on a map. So everything that you have mentioned, I've done. There was a time years ago where I was supposed to teach in Seattle at a workshop, and all these people had signed up, they'd given money. And every time I thought about going, I was like, this is a problem. So I remember calling and canceling the workshop. And then, everybody was upset with me. But the day before I was supposed to give the workshop on the actual time, there was an earthquake that hit the Seattle airport.
Was it Nisqually?
I'm from Atlanta. I,
So if it was Nisqually, I was there. I lived through the Nisqually earthquake.
and maybe probably one of the most dramatic stories that I have to tell was I was in London in 2015, and once again there were 10 people who were all scheduled for me to do healing work with them on a Thursday. And I mean, the sequence of events was actually kind of interesting, because I remember being on a train on the Monday before the Thursday, and all of a sudden I just felt this huge wave of incoming negativity, and I could not figure out what it was.
Mm.
And when I tuned in, I thought somebody must be talking trash about me. I didn't know who it was or why. I'm a Reiki master. I drew my Reiki symbols. I put my hands up and I couldn't stop the energy. And then the next day, which was a Tuesday, I was in a crystal shop and I saw these two crystals. I was like, oh my God, I need these. Well, when I went home, I looked them up. They were aqua aura quartz, and aqua aura quartz protects you against psychic attack. And anyway, my friend who had scheduled all these people to see me, I called him up and I said, I'm so sorry I can't come on Thursday. And everybody was really mad at me and I didn't know what was going to happen. But what I knew was that if I went into London, I would have trouble getting back. And I went into London the Wednesday. I went to Covent Garden, in and out, no trouble, did what I had to do. But I canceled Thursday. Everybody was really mad at me until Thursday morning. I suddenly had all this free time. So I'm out taking a walk. It was a beautiful day in the sunshine. I come back and the TV showed that terrorists had blown up the subway and over 50 people died. And so anyway, we could go on, but um,
But you understand, and you've had life-saving experiences yourself
absolutely. And
through your clairsentience. I had asked you about the symbols, the symbolic language, because some people do perceive through the symbols, and so I was
yes,
curious if you also
yes,
perceive through the symbols. But it
yes,
sounds like you've had some pretty big, powerful experience as well. Have you had other experiences that were like precognitive, where you saw events happen because you're an
yes,
intuitive?
yes, absolutely. And we could go on, but we want to share you and your wonderful book. So absolutely. And
Okay.
yes, I receive information through symbols. And the last personal story that I'll tell is in 2020, in March 2020, I love owls, and my main power animal is snow leopard. Okay,
Hmm.
and I have hawk and hummingbird, but all of a sudden there were all these owls, and um, owl is about seeing in the darkness. And there was one day when there was an owl at the bottom of my driveway and sat in a tree and he stared at me for 30 minutes. And another day I'm out in my garden teaching Qigong and this owl is staring at me. And another day I'm out in my hammock and then an owl like practically dive bombs me. But owl gives you that capacity to see in the darkness. And of course, 2020 was an incredibly dark year, but I could still see.
Yeah, well, I think so many of us have had to go inward. I mean, our whole society has had to go inward and isolate and deal with that darkness, the dark night of the soul, and come out. And we're still coming out of it. And so there's still that heaviness of grief and sadness. And so I think it is really good that there's people like yourself who have done the work, because sensitive people who have done the work and who have come out and found that psychological wholeness will be able to help others. You can't lead other people unless you've been there yourself. And a lot of sensitive people they have been through the dark night of the soul. And sensitivity does have a tendency to do that, to lead you to places that you need to heal or guide you to people that you need in your life. I mean, I do believe in that.
For sure. And yeah, I mean, I've taken photographs that you can see on my website, catherinecarrigan.com, of angels all around my home and my garden and my healing room.
How
Um,
do you see the angels? Is it through light or is it through sparkles? I mean, it's different for everybody, I know, but I'm just curious how you
well,
perceive
I've
them.
actually taken photographs with them of them with my iPhone.
Wow,
And
cool.
they're there and everybody's like, oh sure, and then you look at the photos and you're like, oh my god, there's an angel. So but going back to what you were saying, Courtney Marchesani, I personally feel that when you are a highly sensitive person, you have to become strong enough to handle your sensitivity.
Hmm.
So
Yeah, definitely.
you've done this yourself. How do you feel that people who are sensitive can become strong enough to be that container for the divine information that comes through us?
Well, when you are gifted, we're talking about giftedness, really, is what it is. Giftedness of a different kind that hasn't really been well defined by our society, but you still know it exists because they have experiences. Gifted sensitives will have experiences. So, always my first advice is to validate yourself, right? Validate your experiences. They are true. I mean, mine were pretty dramatic and were hard to deny or ignore. But it doesn't always work like that. Oftentimes, it's very subtle. It's a very subtle synchronistic events, or it's a subtlety that you perceive. So my first thing is always to acknowledge those events in yourself and acknowledge your giftedness. The second thing I like to share with people is, what you're talking about, which is resilience, to be able to build the capacity to be in environments and not feel like you're going to have a breakdown, right? In the clinical research, it was called overload, sensory overload, sensory overwhelm. And sensory overwhelm is real, okay? That's how we typically find out we're sensitive, is we go past our own internal threshold of what we can mentally and emotionally deal with and get pushed to the limit. So I often tell people, like you need to back away from environments and figure out what the trigger is, because these triggering events, especially if you're feeling attacked, right, will trigger you into more sensitive states. And then it's kind of like a vicious cycle that you can't get out of, where you're always constantly feeling stressed. And we know stress affects our health. It affects our mental health. It affects our physical health. And so sensitive people need to deal with stress routinely. If you isolate yourself from sensitivity and you find yourself leaving society, becoming more isolative, sensitivity actually gets worse. When you leave environments that would help you basically build resilience, you get more sensitive and have more sensitive states. So we just saw that with the pandemic. Everybody's isolating, right? And so everybody's feeling more sensitive than they otherwise would if they're going to work regularly or being in community. So it's about self-care. Okay, it's about acknowledging you're sensitive. It's about acknowledging that you have gifts. Those are good things. And then it's about routine self-care and what works for you. What works for one sensitive doesn't work for another, because it's all tied into your central nervous system, and everybody's central nervous system is different. But what I've done in the book is basically given strategies, alternative or complementary healthcare strategies for sensitives to identify their own gift and then what might be happening for them, and then target your self-care. Routine self-care will help you feel balanced more often and less sensory overwhelm or overload.
Great suggestions. And, when you're talking about that overload, for someone who's not experienced this before, what I used to say was it was like 1,000 volts of electricity coming through an ordinary light socket,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
where you're just receiving so much energy and information, and you're just this one little person who, it's like, wait, it's just me. And I know for myself, like when I go to write books and I'm channeling the information, I've had to say to my angels, slow down. I'm going
Well,
to be.
it sounds like you have a pretty wide perception. You have a pretty wide field of perception, and it sounds like you're pretty expansiveness. It's also been described to me like a fire hose being sprayed on you of energy that you can't really contain. So you have to let it hit you. And so that's also like riding the wave. You
Mhm.
have to ride the wave through the energetic currents and not just seize up, because then you're not really integrating everything, and that could also cause a shutdown. So it sounds to me like you have a pretty wide perceptive awareness.
That is correct. That is very correct. And I agree with you about self-care, and self-care could include. I feel that really highly sensitive people, they're more open to the universe. So one of the things that's really helpful is grounding.
Very.
Everything that's grounds you. So if you think about like a lightning rod, the way that it works is, if you're just out and about, you could get electrocuted, but if you're grounded, that energy has a place to go. So everything that grounds you, gardening, walking barefoot, drumming, physical exercise.
Physical exercise has been proven to help build resiliency with sensitivity. They did this study of Japanese college students who were also indicated for depression. And they did exercise, routine movement, nothing aggressive, but routine exercise. And it did show to help being able to deal with symptoms from sensitivity. So yes, anything physical that gets your heart rate moving, and the thing about it is you find what works for you. You really find what works for you. Some people, some sensitives really need that physical labor, that hard movement to really feel that burn of, electricity moving out of their body. Because let's face it, it is energetic. Whether it's having more electricity, moving in your brain, or more things in your body, or maybe there's something that's stagnant in the body or lowered because it's an under responsiveness. Movement therapies, or yoga, walking, mindful meditation, movement, anything along those lines is going to help you develop your own therapeutic
Yeah.
outlet, essentially, to be able to cope while you're in those environments without feeling maxed out.
Yeah, and I'm 62. I still teach yoga 7 times a week, because anything yoga, qigong, tai chi, I think for highly sensitive people, they're going to
Love it.
balance that energy system so that you can handle
I
it.
love qigong. I think one of my favorite moves of qigong is the swan. Have you ever done the swan movement?
Mhm.
Where you're up and you're moving your arms and it's like you're flying. That's such a magnificent movement. And so Qigong is another wonderful, gentle movement practice. Sensitive people need gentle. They do. They really need they need to start with gentle movements and then build into the more vigorous stuff, because they're so easily affected. They usually don't like gyms. They don't want to work out in communities of other people. They're very reticent. So it's about being able to do things and be inspired by things that you enjoy doing that help you feel really good. Like there is a bliss there's a bliss yoga style yoga that for me as an empath, as an intuitive empath, just lights me up. I mean, I really do feel I had this one moment in class when I was doing my yoga teacher training where I had this full expansive movement through the bliss yoga and I felt energy pouring, just pouring out of my heart as if it was like a sun was opened up and rays were coming through. And it was such a profound thing that afterwards I looked over at my partner who was also sensitive and I tried to describe it to her and I was like, "Did you feel that?" And she was like, "No." She was like, I can imagine, how that feels. And so sensitive people, when they do those kind of things, they feel that kind of stuff. I mean, that's really how you stand out as a sensitive or even as a hypersensitive person. You're going to feel these profound effects. Then you try to share it with other people and they're like, yeah, no, not so much. And so I kind of saw that trend where I would always have these powerful, deep, magnificent experiences and I would share it. And I thought, well, there is definitely something different, about me. And so it's about finding what works for you. And so I've had pretty profound experience uses all kind of movement therapies because it's that sentient feeling. It's that feeling connected, especially in nature. If you can connect your walks or your qigong in nature, there's nothing like it.
I agree. Now, Courtney Marchesani, the author of The Four Gifts of the Highly Sensitive, let's go back to the four gifts. Can
Sure.
you break them down one by one and explain for our audience exactly what is that?
Yeah, well, we've had a thread through the conversation where we've been talking about intuitives and empaths, a little bit of visionary. Intuitives are the individuals who are able to use very quick, decisive decision making. So they get information at a lightning fast speed. They don't always know where it comes from. They can't always tell where it comes from, but they can get to A to Z without knowing how or why. So it's really like the nuts and bolts of it is with people who are super intuitive, they have the ability to pull information from their unconscious really fast. And it almost feels magical when it happens. They also have the ability to look out into the world and see the interconnectedness of life. So they find patterns, they follow their intuition and their interests, and it seems to be that they can do over multiple overlapping systems analysis and systems thinking. They're really good at looking at the big picture. And they use sometimes inventiveness to figure out what's needed. They're oftentimes social disruptors. So they disrupt things that they feel are not equitable to provide equality. And so they find solutions that way. They're typically entrepreneurs. They're very entrepreneurial. They're great poker players. I mean, intuitives are just, they're everywhere. And they use that decision process very, very, very well. The second type is empaths. So empaths feel other people's feelings within their own mind and body. So it's that sentience, it's that clear feeling, it's the feeling of other people's, their own emotions in their own body, which I always find when I say it sounds surreal, but it actually is true. And so the empaths are the deep feelers that connect to other people. They can sense their motivations, sometimes hidden motivations. They're really great relational people. So then in the book, I go into the different types of empaths, the compassionate empath, the spiritual empath, the counselor empath, and break that out because that empathy isn't just empathy. It can actually be, when developed, used to be talents in your life that you can use in a practical way. Empaths struggle. They do struggle if they don't know they're empathic. So the third was visionary. Visionaries are individuals who have a very fine, subtle awareness of the mind's eye. So right in front of their eyes, in that imaginal space, they are able to envision and picture 3 and 4 dimensionally, turn things over, objects. Different kinds of spatial awareness comes very easy to them in terms of mapping, facial recognition, directions. These people are very good at problem solving. So they're always trying to solve problems using the visual field, which is their gift and their skill set. And that breaks out in different ways like it does with the empath. So you have different visionaries who are like myself, who have imaginal adept at imaginal thinking in the visual field, but also get images, clairvoyant images. But then there's visionaries who don't get clairvoyant images, but they're really good at things that are applied technically, like construction managers or interior designers who use energy of spaces, architects. So it depends. And so in the book, I go into the different types of visionary experiences and how they can be used or applied in your life. And then there's the expressives. The expressives are the individuals who are the quintessential creators. They go into their environment and they feel beauty, harmony in their environments. They definitely have a deep yearning or desire to create meaning out of what they see, hear, and feel. And so they synthesize what they perceive in their environment into an artistic fusion that they determine or interpret through their own experience, and then they create from it. So they create meaning. So they're the writers, the artists, the dancers, the painters, the individuals who help us understand what it means to be human through their artistic perception.
That's just wonderful. Now, as you and I both know, it is possible for you as a person, if you're listening to this broadcast, you may go, oh, I relate to this and I relate to that. And you may have many gifts, right?
Overlapping.
Have overlapping gifts.
It's like a multi-sensory intelligence is what I call it. So they overlap in interesting and beautiful ways. They converge. It's a convergence.
Yeah. And so how would you describe someone who's all of these gifts are open and they're using them in their life?
They blend. They blend together in really interesting, delicate, creative ways. I mean, that's the part that I find so fascinating and really like to dig down into. Well, what makes one person a true visionary versus an intuitive visionary? What makes one person an expressive, an empathic expressive versus an intuitive expressive? Or an intuitive visionary with expressive qualities. And so that's the part that I would like to go further with the research into maybe like a PhD project, because I call it sensory processing styles. It's the way that you've used your sensitivity, giftedness to develop it and apply it in the world for society, right? For a greater purpose beyond yourself. And so that's the thing I think it's so unique. So you'll see it in somebody who is very intuitive and they also have a visionary quality. So they have the ability to have that fast, lightning fast solution when they're asking questions and they follow it intuitively. But then there's a visionary quality. So you might see a cinematographer who has a story and it's very intuitively coming to them and it's creative. But then you see the visionary quality in people like Martin Scorsese, where he, uses his visual acuity to develop the film. He's obviously an intuitive visionary. I mean, I don't know that, but I suspect that he has both those gifts. And, what a lot of people might know is when he was young, he was kind of, homebound, right? And I think he also had a vision disability for a while. And so he was sensitive because he had to remove himself from his environment. And then you see the gifts, developed because he loved story, and then he applies it by being a filmmaker. So you have to basically look at a person's life and their lived experience to figure out how the gifts have worked. My hope with the book is that people who are on the journey would find it and then start to develop their gifts even more so that they could apply them.
So Courtney Marchesani, the author of Four Gifts of the Highly Sensitive, I'm going to ask you a question that people ask me all the time. As a medical intuitive healer, I have so many people that are like, can you help me be more intuitive? And to me, I'm going to summarize because I want to hear what you have to say, but a lot of it's to me just removing the ego blocks so that you can receive the information that you're already receiving. So if someone said to you, Courtney Marchesani, how can I become more intuitive? What would you say to them?
Well, let's define the ego, so the psyche is the area in our mental state, right? You have egoic You have your ego, which is your personification of yourself. Then you have the unconscious, which is what's below your conscious awareness. And then you have your conscious awareness, which is what you're perceiving and what you're aware of. So the ego, we are not always aware of our ego.
Mhm.
But through what you're talking about, becoming aware of your ego, then you become more intuitive because you're using maybe less judgment or you're using less of an interpretive function. So I would agree. I would agree that our ego sometimes doesn't allow the intuition to work. I also think that if you are a truly deep intuitive, there are some things the ego cannot get in the way of. And so pay attention to those life alarms because that surpasses the ego. And so if you want to become more intuitive, you have to first recognize those moments that are like life-saving or life alerts, life events where your intuition is saying this is not good for you. That's the problem, really. The crux of it is we don't listen to it. It's there. Like you said, it does warn you, but we usually push past it and go, well, what's that weird feeling? Well, that is usually an intuitive hit that you cannot detect and the ego cannot judge. And so those are the things that sometimes feel a little crazy because you're picking up on stuff, but you're not sure what it is. And your intuition might not be fully in your awareness. Where you now, when you get intuitive over time, like you have, you start to know what it feels like. You start to be able to detect how your own intuition works for you. And so that's my first bit of advice. Find out how your intuition works for you. Some people, it comes through auditory. So it primarily comes to me through auditory. I'll hear a subtle voice or I'll feel something, kind of come into my awareness that's an actual feeling, a subtle feeling that I detect. But it's different for everybody. Some people feel it in their gut. They really feel that gut sensation, which is a more of an instinctual intuition. So I tell people, yes, try to get out of the ego, but the ego also serves us in really important ways to keep us safe and keep us protected because it's a defense mechanism. So it's a balancing act. The way to develop is to test yourself, really test yourself, really hardcore test yourself. I mean, I had to. And I know that people don't want to hear, oh, having to take a test, but it's not really like that. It's writing down what you feel to detect how your intuition works from you, and you will see a pattern of how it works for you. And it's very specific, it works in specific ways. So pay attention to your auditory sensations, because a lot of times sensitive people have sound sensitivity or auditory sensitivity. Pay attention to your body, your gut level feelings or sensations in your body that twig you onto something that's happening in the environment that's an intuitive sense. Pay attention to your relationships and the way you relate to others, because that's always another way that you get profound intuitive advice is through awareness of others. And try not to negate it and say, oh, that's nothing. Try to write things down for a while and then track your feelings.
So all great suggestions. In my view, our intuition, and this gets a little bit technical because that is frequently associated with clairaudience, which is
Mm-hmm.
hearing messages in an auditory way. But
Mm-hmm.
it's my belief that you are a soul. And what is commonly thought of as your intuition is literally just your soul guidance. And because you are a soul, your soul is guiding you 24/7. So it's really just a question of whether or not you're paying attention. And as we pay attention, then it becomes more apparent that that's what that is. I also find that it's very helpful to just set aside time uh, for a spiritual practice, beginning with prayer, meditation, and perhaps breath work every day, where you quiet your mind and you ask for guidance. And I have a personal practice of prayer and meditation every morning, and then I turn on my intuition every single day by asking, what do I need to wear? And then I start seeing colors. I'll say, where do you need to wear this color? You need to wear this jewelry. And sometimes it's for me, and sometimes it's for my clients. And then I'm, again, asking for guidance about the day. So I don't think you can ask for guidance too often. And if you start with simple things like when do I go to the grocery or what should I buy, for dinner or what have you.
Yeah, I believe in the soul too. I didn't used to. I have to be fully transparent. I used to be very atheistic, mostly because of the household that I grew up in. So my belief system was this is hit here and now.
Mhm.
There's nothing else. Which I thought kind of was empowering in a way when I was young, because then that you were responsible, right, for your actions. And I think a lot of that came through, for lack of a better word, Catholic programming, where I would see my relatives, some of them, not all of them, but some of them be really um, just awful, right? Just awful and treating other people awful, and then go to confession. And then, there was that whole ideology of you still get to go. And I thought, well, in a way, atheism was more powerful because you wouldn't treat people like that if you think that this is it. But I had to change my own perspective because I had experiences that made me change my own perspective. When my ex husband's grandmother passed away, my first experience of the afterlife was when she came to me in a dream after she passed. And I wasn't able to go. I was invited to come to the funeral, even though we were divorced. And she still came to me. And so when that happened, that changed my belief system. I had to go, there's something else going on. So I do believe that the soul communicates to us. I do believe it uses our intuition. And there's whole groups of individuals out there who believe the intuition is the communication avenue of the soul, the spiritual development connection to your soul contact.
Yeah, and
I think the other important thing, just quickly, that you mentioned about asking for guidance and doing it too often, about the grocery store and other stuff. I mean, I think that feeds into anxiety. And so I think that we're already, sensitive people are very anxious already, and we're perceiving more. And if we don't realize we're perceiving more, we become very anxious. And so I feel there's a delicate balancing act between trusting yourself and your own knowledge, your own storehouse, and versus going into the divine. My experiences with the divine at times have been somewhat ecstatic, where it felt like a complete transpersonal awareness, out of body almost, or through traveling, astral traveling, through dreams and others. But I wanted to just say that, trust yourself on a daily basis. It'll serve you.
wonderful information. You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Our guest today has been clinical health coach and author Courtney Marchesani. We've been talking with her about her new book, The Four Gifts of the Highly Sensitive. You can find out more about Courtney Marchesani and her wonderful work at her website, inspiredpotentials.com. And remember, you are a soul. Your soul is always trying to communicate with you so you can listen and open your intuitive gifts naturally. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.